most people think silence means losing. Losing arguments, losing status, losing control. Buddhism says the opposite. The moment you stop reacting, you stop being owned. Every time your mind jumps, someone else is pulling the strings. Every time you feel compelled to respond, explain, or defend, power is leaving you. This is not about being calm. This is about reclaiming authority over your own mind. The silent mind doesn't beg, doesn't chase, doesn't panic. It watches. And while the world is busy provoking, pressuring, and distracting, the silent mind stands untouched. That is why it always wins. 1. Reaction is the first form of slavery. In Buddhism, suffering does not begin with pain. It begins earlier than that. It begins the moment the mind reacts without awareness. This is a hard truth most people don't want to face, because it means you are not being controlled by the world, you are being controlled by your own habits. Anger rises, and before you even realize it, your mouth opens, fear appears, and your body tightens, retreats, or panics. Desire shows up, and suddenly you are chasing, scrolling, craving, or proving something. This happens so fast that it feels automatic. And that is exactly the problem. Automatic reaction is not freedom. It is programming. Look closely at your daily life. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and your mood is ruined. A comment online irritates you, and your mind replays it for hours. Someone ignores you, and insecurity floods in. None of these people touched you physically. None of these events harmed you directly. Yet your peace disappeared instantly. Why? Because the mind reacted before awareness could step in. Buddhism calls this ignorance not stupidity, but unconsciousness, living without seeing. A reactive mind is a trained mind. From childhood, you were taught to react, defend yourself, prove your worth, chase approval, avoid discomfort. Over time, reaction becomes identity. You start to believe that your anger is you, your fear is you, your impulses are you. But Buddhism makes a radical claim. These reactions are not you. They are conditioned responses. And anything conditioned can be unconditioned. Here's the brutal part. A reactive mind is predictable. And anything predictable can be manipulated. People push your buttons because you have buttons. Advertisers trigger your insecurities because they know what you crave. Certain people say certain words because they know you will explode, retreat, or comply. Even situations dominate you because your emotions move faster than your awareness. You are not choosing your reactions, they are choosing you. That is slavery. Not to chains, but to impulses. You might think reacting makes you strong, defending yourself, speaking your mind, expressing emotion. But Buddhism would say the opposite. The person who explodes on command is not powerful, they are exposed. They are open to control. True power begins when the trigger appears and nothing happens. This is where silence enters, and most people misunderstand it. Silence does not mean becoming passive or letting people walk over you. It means interrupting the reflex. When the mind does not immediately react, even for a few seconds, something extraordinary happens. Space appears. That space is everything. In that space, you see the anger instead of becoming it. You feel the fear instead of obeying it. You notice the desire instead of chasing it. And the moment you can observe a reaction, it loses its authority over you. Think about it honestly. How many mistakes in your life came from instant reaction? Words you wish you could take back, decisions made in anger, messages sent in emotion, opportunities ruined because pride spoke before wisdom. Reaction always feels justified in the moment. It always feels necessary. But later, clarity arrives and regret follows. Buddhism is not about becoming emotionless. It is about shortening the distance between impulse and awareness. Silence breaks the chain. When you pause instead of react, you are no longer predictable. People cannot control what they cannot anticipate. Situations lose their grip when you stop feeding them emotional energy. A silent mind does not mean a weak response, it means a chosen response. Sometimes you will speak. Sometimes you will walk away. Sometimes you will confront. But it will come from clarity, not compulsion. This is why the Buddha emphasized mindfulness so relentlessly. Mindfulness is not about sitting on a cushion all day. It is about catching the moment before reaction hardens into action. It is about seeing the spark before the fire. Most people only notice their emotions once the house is already burning. Here's a reality check most people avoid. If someone can make you angry at will, they own you. If a situation can steal your peace instantly, it controls you. Freedom begins the moment you stop handing over that power. And that does not require changing the world. It requires seeing the mind. The silent mind is not weak. It is unhooked. When insults don't immediately land, they fall flat. When fear doesn't immediately dominate, it shrinks. When desire doesn't immediately pull you, it fades. Silence starves reactions of fuel, and without fuel, suffering cannot sustain itself. This lesson is uncomfortable because it removes excuses. You can no longer blame people, circumstances, or fate for your inner chaos. Buddhism puts the responsibility back where it belongs, in awareness. But it also gives you something priceless in return: control. Not control over others, control over yourself. And once reaction no longer rules you, nothing outside you can truly enslave you again. 2. Stillness exposes illusion. Most of what controls you is not real. That sounds comforting, but it's actually disturbing when you really understand it. Buddhism teaches that the mind is a master illusionist. It doesn't simply observe reality, it edits it, exaggerates it, and often completely invents it. And the faster the mind moves, the more convincing those illusions become. This is why stillness is so dangerous to the ego. Stillness exposes the lies. Think about how often you suffer over things that are not happening right now. A conversation from the past replays in your head. A future scenario terrifies you, even though it hasn't occurred. Someone's tone, look, or silence gets interpreted as rejection, disrespect, or threat. None of this is objective reality, it is mental projection. Buddhism calls this delusion not insanity, but mistaking thoughts for truth. A noisy mind cannot tell the difference. When the mind is constantly talking, reacting, judging, predicting, and remembering, everything feels urgent and personal. Thoughts stack on top of thoughts until you feel overwhelmed, anxious, or angry, and you assume that life itself is the problem. But Buddhism flips this perspective completely. The problem is not life. The problem is the commentary running non-stop inside your head. Stillness removes the commentary. When the mind becomes quiet, even briefly, something strange happens. The world does not collapse. You do not disappear. In fact, reality becomes clearer. You begin to see how much of your suffering was never caused by events, but by the stories you told yourself about those events. The insult was real, but the hours of mental replay were optional. The challenge was real, but the catastrophic future you imagined was not. This is why people avoid stillness. Silence forces confrontation with truth. In stillness, you notice how often your mind exaggerates. One mistake becomes, "I always fail." One rejection becomes, "I'm not enough." One uncertain moment becomes, "Everything is falling apart." These thoughts feel real only because they are unchallenged. The moment you sit still and observe them, you see how unstable they are. They rise, they shift, they fade. And suddenly, you realize something unsettling. If thoughts can disappear, they were never solid to begin with. Buddhism teaches that clinging to thoughts is like grabbing smoke. You tighten your grip, and suffering increases, but nothing real is being held. Stillness loosens the grip naturally. You don't have to fight thoughts. You just stop feeding them attention. And without attention, illusions starve. Here's a hard truth most people miss. Emotional pain is amplified by mental noise. The event itself might last seconds. The mental replay lasts days. A quiet mind feels pain fully but briefly. A noisy mind multiplies pain endlessly. This is why two people can experience the same event and suffer completely differently. One adds stories. The other sees reality and lets it pass. Stillness brings you back to what is actually happening, not what might happen, not what should have happened, not what your ego fears is happening. And this is where clarity begins to feel uncomfortable. When illusions fall away, excuses disappear with them. You start to see where you overreacted, where you assumed intentions that were never confirmed, where your pride, fear, or insecurity filled in gaps with worst-case scenarios. This is humbling. The ego prefers noise because noise hides responsibility. Stillness removes the hiding place, but it also removes unnecessary suffering. In Buddhism, wisdom is not about adding new beliefs. It is about removing false ones. Stillness does not give you answers, it strips away distortion. You begin to see that many of the things you chase will not satisfy you. Many of the things you fear will not destroy you. Many of the things you obsess over will not matter in time. This realization does not come from thinking harder. It comes from thinking less. A still mind sees impermanence clearly. Thoughts, emotions, situations all arise and pass. When the mind is noisy, it clings to what arises and resists what passes. This creates tension. Stillness allows you to witness change without panic. And once you see how temporary everything is, illusion loses its grip. You stop treating every emotion as a command and every thought as a fact. This is why stillness feels like relief to some and terror to others. If your identity is built on mental stories, who you think you are, how others should see you, how life must unfold, stillness threatens that identity. But if you are exhausted from carrying those stories, stillness feels like freedom. The silent mind does not mean an empty life. It means a life no longer distorted by unnecessary mental suffering. When illusion dissolves, you stop fighting ghosts. You stop arguing with imagined enemies. You stop punishing yourself for futures that never arrive. What remains is grounded awareness, calm, alert, and present. And presence is powerful because reality can only be dealt with when it is seen clearly. Stillness does not make life easy. It makes life real. And once you see clearly, illusion can never control you the same way again. 3. Silence is not suppression. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they hear about silence in Buddhism is assuming it means bottling things up, staying quiet, pretending you're fine, forcing yourself to be calm while everything inside is boiling. That is not silence. That is pressure. And pressure always explodes eventually. Buddhism makes a sharp distinction that most people never learn. Suppression creates suffering. Awareness dissolves it. Suppression is when emotion arises and you immediately judge it. I shouldn't feel this. This is wrong. I need to get rid of this. So you push it down. You distract yourself. You numb it. You smile while resentment builds underneath. That is not mastery. That is avoidance. And avoided emotions don't disappear, they wait. Silence is something completely different. Silence means the emotion is allowed to exist, but it is not allowed to take control. Anger can be there without becoming words. Fear can be there without becoming panic. Sadness can be there without becoming self-pity. You don't deny the feeling, and you don't act it out. You observe it. This is uncomfortable at first because most people have never actually felt their emotions without reacting to them. Think about it honestly. When anger appears, what usually happens? The mind looks for a target, someone to blame, something to say. When fear appears, the mind rushes to escape, avoid, or overthink. When sadness appears, the mind creates stories about the past or the future. Very rarely do people simply stay with the raw sensation. Buddhism trains exactly that skill. When you stay silent internally, you begin to notice something important. Emotions are physical sensations first, not commands. Tightness in the chest, heat in the body, restlessness, heaviness. These sensations rise, peak, and fall. They feel intense, but they are temporary. The moment you stop adding mental commentary, the emotion begins to dissolve on its own. This is why silence feels powerful. You are no longer fighting yourself. Suppression says, "This emotion is dangerous." Silence says, "This emotion is temporary." That shift changes everything. Most emotional suffering is not caused by the feeling itself, but by resistance to it. Anger hurts because you either explode or suppress. Fear hurts because you try to outrun it. Sadness hurts because you drown it in stories. Silence removes resistance. And without resistance, suffering loses its fuel. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Emotions only dominate you when you believe they must be acted on. Buddhism dismantles that belief. Just because anger arises does not mean you must speak. Just because desire arises does not mean you must chase. Just because fear arises does not mean you must retreat. An emotion arising is not a command, it is information. Silence gives you access to that information without being hijacked by it. This is where real strength is built. Not the strength of repression, but the strength of containment. You feel fully, but you move deliberately. You are no longer ruled by inner storms. You stand in the middle of them, aware, steady, present. And something surprising happens over time. When emotions realize they are being seen, but not obeyed, they soften. Anger shortens, fear weakens, craving loses urgency. You don't need to force them away, they lose power naturally. This is why Buddhism emphasizes observation over control. Control creates tension, observation creates freedom. People who suppress emotions often appear calm on the surface, but they are fragile. A single trigger breaks them. A silent mind, on the other hand, becomes resilient. It has felt the emotion without being consumed by it. It knows the emotion will pass. That knowledge creates inner stability that cannot be shaken easily. This is also why silence does not make you passive. You can still set boundaries. You can still speak when needed. You can still act decisively. The difference is that action comes from clarity, not emotional overflow. You are no longer reacting to discharge emotion. You are responding to reality. Most people talk to release tension. A silent mind speaks to communicate truth. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of compulsion. You are free not when emotions disappear, but when they no longer control your behavior. Silence trains that freedom. At first, staying silent feels unnatural. The ego feels ignored. The habit of reaction protests. But with practice, silence becomes grounding. You stop being afraid of your inner world because you've seen that it cannot harm you unless you let it take the wheel. This is why silence is not weakness. It is discipline. It is courage. It is the ability to sit with discomfort without becoming it. And once you master that, Emotions stop being enemies. They become passing weather. You remain the sky. That is silence without suppression, and it is one of the deepest forms of inner power Buddhism teaches. Quiet mind is invisible to manipulation. Most people like to believe they are independent thinkers. They're not. They are reactive systems. Push the right button, and they respond exactly as expected. Buddhism exposes this uncomfortable reality without mercy. If your emotions can be triggered on command, you are not in control, you are accessible. And accessibility is vulnerability. Manipulation does not require intelligence or force. It requires predictability. Look at how easily moods are influenced. A single comment changes your tone for the entire day. A look of disapproval makes you shrink or overcompensate. Praise inflates you. Criticism deflates you. None of this is accidental. People, systems, and even algorithms thrive on emotional reaction. They poke, provoke, and pressure because they know the mind will react before awareness steps in. A quiet mind breaks this system completely. In Buddhism, non-reactivity is not moral superiority, it is strategic clarity. When the mind is silent, triggers fail. Insults lose momentum because there is nothing to hook into. Fear-based pressure collapses because panic never ignites. Urgency loses power because the mind refuses to be rushed. Think about it honestly. When someone tries to manipulate you, what are they actually doing? They are trying to provoke an internal reaction: guilt, fear, desire, shame. Once that reaction is activated, your behavior becomes predictable. You explain yourself, you justify, you comply, or you explode and lose position. Silence interrupts that entire sequence. A quiet mind creates delay, and delay destroys manipulation. When you don't respond immediately, the manipulator loses leverage. They expected emotion. They received nothing. They expected defense. They met stillness. This creates imbalance not in you, but in them, because manipulation requires feedback. Without reaction, the tactic collapses. This is why people who remain calm under pressure appear intimidating, not aggressive, not dominant. Intimidating, because they are unreadable. You cannot steer what you cannot read. Buddhism does not teach you to become cold or detached from humanity. It teaches you to stop advertising your emotional weak points. The quieter the mind, the fewer entry points exist for control. Observe how people lose arguments, rarely because they are wrong, usually because they react. They raise their voice, they over-explain, they defend ego instead of truth. The person who stays silent longer often controls the direction of the interaction, not because they are manipulative, but because they are not manipulable. This principle applies far beyond conversations. Consumer culture feeds on emotional noise, fear of missing out, insecurity, comparison, desire for status. A silent mind is immune to most of it. When the mind is calm, you notice the trigger instead of obeying it. The advertisement loses its spell. The pressure to conform weakens. You choose instead of react. This is why monks can live with almost nothing and feel complete. Their minds are not available for exploitation. A quiet mind also protects you from internal manipulation, which is even more dangerous. Your own thoughts constantly attempt to rush you. Act now, say something, fix this immediately. Buddhism teaches that urgency is often a lie. Silence allows you to question that urgency. Is action truly required, or is the ego uncomfortable with uncertainty? Is this decision wise, or just emotionally convenient? When the mind is noisy, these questions never get asked. Reaction feels like action. Silence exposes the difference. People often confuse silence with weakness because they are used to noise being mistaken for strength. loud opinions, quick responses, emotional displays. Buddhism dismantles this illusion. Real strength is the ability to remain unmoved while fully aware. That kind of strength cannot be provoked into mistakes. This is why silence feels threatening to manipulators. They rely on emotional leakage. The moment you stop leaking, they lose influence. They may escalate tactics, louder insults, sharper pressure, guilt, praise. But if the mind remains quiet, none of it lands. And eventually, they stop trying not because you fought them, but because you were unreachable. A quiet mind does not seek control over others. It simply refuses to surrender control of itself. That is why it is invisible to manipulation. And in a world built on triggering reactions, that invisibility is power. 5. The silent mind acts with precision. Most people confuse movement with progress. They believe that acting quickly means acting effectively. Buddhism challenges this assumption directly. Speed without clarity is not power, it is waste. A noisy mind creates urgency, and urgency creates mistakes. The silent mind, on the other hand, does not rush, it waits. And when it moves cleanly. Look at how impulsive action usually unfolds. A strong emotion appears, and the mind demands immediate discharge. Words are spoken to release tension, not to solve anything. Decisions are made to escape discomfort, not to improve outcomes. Action becomes emotional relief rather than strategic response. Buddhism would say this is not action at all. It is reaction, wearing the mask of action. A silent mind sees the difference. When the mind is quiet, it is no longer pushed by inner noise. Thoughts slow down. Emotional urgency loses its grip. In this state, you begin to notice details that were previously invisible. Timing becomes clearer. Consequences become easier to predict. You stop acting just to feel better and start acting to be effective. Precision is born from stillness. Think about the moments in your life when your actions actually worked. Not the times you felt justified, but the times you got real results. Chances are, those actions were taken after reflection, not impulse. You paused. You observed. You chose your words carefully. You waited for the right moment. That is the silent mind at work. Buddhism teaches that right action arises naturally from right awareness. When awareness is clouded by emotion, action becomes sloppy. When awareness is clear, action becomes minimal and effective. You stop doing 10 unnecessary things and start doing one necessary thing. This is deeply uncomfortable for the ego. The ego wants constant movement because movement creates the illusion of control. Doing something, anything, feels safer than waiting. Silence feels like inaction, and inaction feels like weakness. Buddhism exposes this fear. Silence is not inaction, it is preparation. A silent mind is always observing. It watches patterns instead of reacting to moments. It notices how people behave over time, not just how they behave once. It sees when silence will communicate more than words. It understands when action will escalate and when it will resolve. This level of perception is impossible when the mind is loud and impatient. Precision also means knowing when not to act. Most people damage their position by overacting. They explain too much. They defend unnecessarily. They respond to provocation that didn't require a response. A silent mind recognizes that not every stimulus deserves a reply. Restraint becomes strategy. And restraint is often more powerful than confrontation. Buddhism does not glorify passivity, but it deeply values restraint. Restraint is the ability to hold energy until it is needed. When you act from silence, your actions carry weight. They are not diluted by emotional excess. People listen because you do not speak constantly. Your decisions matter because you do not make them impulsively. This is why calm individuals often dominate chaotic environments without raising their voice. Their presence alone signals control, not control over others, but control over themselves. And self-control creates trust. People sense when your actions are grounded rather than reactive. Even opponents hesitate when they cannot predict your next move. A silent mind also reduces regret. Most regret comes from things said or done too quickly. Precision minimizes collateral damage. You stop burning bridges unnecessarily. You stop creating problems that didn't need to exist. Life becomes simpler because you are no longer constantly cleaning up after impulsive decisions. Buddhism teaches that wise action leaves no residue. When action arises from clarity, it does not generate guilt, shame, or self-doubt. Even if the outcome is imperfect, the mind remains steady because it knows the action was conscious. This inner stability is rare and powerful. The silent mind also understands timing. There is a moment when action is premature and a moment when action is unstoppable. Noise blinds you to both. Silence sharpens intuition. You begin to feel when to move and when to wait. This is not mystical. It is attentiveness refined through stillness. In a world obsessed with speed, the silent mind appears slow. But over time, it wins consistently. While others exhaust themselves reacting to every stimulus, the silent mind conserves energy and applies it exactly where it matters. One clean move beats 10 frantic ones. This is the precision Buddhism points toward. Not dramatic, not loud, not impulsive, just effective. And once you experience the power of acting from silence, you realize something unsettling. Most action you took before was unnecessary. The silent mind does less and achieves more. 6. Detachment is the source of invincibility. Most people think attachment is love, motivation, or purpose. Buddhism dismantles this belief without comfort. Attachment is not connection, it is dependence. And dependence is weakness. The moment your peace depends on an outcome, a person, or an identity, you become vulnerable to loss, fear, and manipulation. Attachment is the hidden contract you make with the world. If this goes my way, I'm okay. If it doesn't, I suffer. That contract guarantees suffering. In Buddhism, detachment does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop clinging. You still act, still love, still build, but you no longer tie your inner stability to external results. This distinction is critical, and most people miss it. Look at what truly controls people. It is not pain alone. It is the fear of losing what they are attached to. Status, validation, being right, being admired, being needed. These attachments turn everyday situations into emotional minefields. A single threat to identity can destabilize the entire mind. Detachment removes the trigger. When the mind becomes silent, attachment loosens naturally. You begin to see how fragile your sense of self was when it depended on approval, outcomes, or recognition. You notice how much energy was spent protecting an image instead of living truthfully. This realization is unsettling, but it is also liberating. A detached mind is difficult to threaten. If you are not attached to praise, flattery loses power. If you are not attached to being right, arguments lose intensity. If you are not attached to outcomes, failure loses its ability to break you. Detachment collapses the leverage others have over you. This is why Buddhism treats non-attachment as strength, not indifference. The attached mind overreacts because it feels constantly at risk. Every interaction becomes personal. Every setback feels like an attack. Detachment creates emotional distance, not coldness, but perspective. You can care deeply without losing yourself. Detachment also ends desperation. Desperation is attachment under pressure, the need to control outcomes, the need to secure approval, the need to avoid loss at all costs. This energy is visible, people sense it, and where there is desperation, there is vulnerability. A detached mind moves without urgency. It can walk away without panic. It can wait without anxiety. This makes it formidable. In Buddhism, suffering is not caused by loss, but by clinging. Loss is inevitable. Change is unavoidable. Impermanence governs everything. The silent mind accepts this instead of resisting it. Acceptance does not mean resignation. It means alignment with reality. Once you stop fighting impermanence, fear loses its grip. Most anxiety is fear of change. Most anger is resistance to reality. Detachment dissolves both. You stop demanding that life behave according to your expectations, and when expectations dissolve, disappointment weakens. This does not make you passive. It makes you adaptable. A detached mind can adjust quickly because it is not emotionally anchored to fixed outcomes. When circumstances shift, you shift. When plans fail, you recalibrate. There is no identity collapse because your identity was never built on fragile structures to begin with. This is what invincibility looks like in Buddhism. Not dominance, not control, stability. A detached mind cannot be easily provoked because there is nothing to protect. Ego-driven reactions fade when ego attachment fades. Insults lose their sting. Setbacks lose their drama. You begin to respond from clarity instead of wounded pride. Detachment also sharpens focus. When you are not obsessed with outcomes, you can give full attention to process. You do the work without constantly checking results. This paradoxically improves performance. Anxiety decreases, presence increases, effort becomes cleaner and more sustainable. Buddhism teaches that peace is not found by arranging the world perfectly, but by loosening the grip on how it must be. This is not defeat. It is maturity. People often fear detachment because they think it will make life empty. The opposite happens. When attachment loosens, appreciation deepens. You enjoy experiences without trying to possess them. You value relationships without needing them to define you. You engage fully, yet remain free. That freedom is rare, and it is powerful. When nothing external controls your inner state, you become difficult to destabilize. Pressure fails. Manipulation collapses. Fear loses its urgency. This is not because you no longer feel it, it's because feeling no longer rules you. Detachment does not remove you from life. It removes life's ability to own you. And once that happens, invincibility stops being a fantasy. It becomes a quiet, grounded reality. 7. Silence is the end of suffering and the beginning of power. Buddhism makes a claim that sounds simple, but cuts deeper the longer you sit with it. Suffering does not come from life itself. It comes from the mind's refusal to be still. Pain happens, loss happens, change happens. But suffering is what the mind adds when it argues with reality, and that argument is loud. Most people are constantly negotiating with life inside their heads. This should not have happened. That should have gone differently. I deserve more. I can't accept this. The mind keeps talking, replaying, resisting, demanding. And as long as that inner noise continues, suffering continues. Silence is not an escape from life. It is the end of that argument. This is where Buddhism becomes radically practical. Silence does not mean shutting down thought completely. That would be impossible. Silence means the mind stops clinging to unnecessary thought. The endless commentary, the compulsive judgment, the mental replay that keeps wounds open long after the moment has passed. When that noise quiets, something profound happens. suffering loses its fuel. Look closely at your own experience. When you are suffering, what is actually happening? Is it the situation itself or the thoughts surrounding it? A breakup hurts, but the real suffering comes from the stories. I'll always be alone. I wasn't enough. I wasted years. A mistake stings, but the suffering comes from replay. I ruined everything. I should have known better. People will never respect me again. Buddhism points directly at this mechanism. The pain may be unavoidable. The mental noise is optional. Silence ends the loop. When the mind becomes silent, even briefly, you feel pain without resistance, and pain without resistance transforms. It moves through instead of lodging inside. Most people never allow this to happen because they are terrified of stillness. They fear that if they stop thinking, they will collapse. The opposite is true. When thinking stops compulsively, stability appears. This is the moment suffering begins to dissolve. But silence does more than end suffering. It creates power. Not loud power, not dominance, not control over others. A quieter, deeper power that cannot be taken away. Power begins with presence. A silent mind is fully present because it is not split between now and 1,000 imagined scenarios. Presence sharpens perception. You see what is actually happening, not what fear predicts or desire demands. This clarity alone gives you an advantage in every area of life. Most people are fighting shadows. You are dealing with reality. From presence comes composure. When the mind is silent, emotions still arise, but they do not destabilize you. You feel without collapsing. You face difficulty without panic. You remain steady when others are frantic. This composure is often mistaken for emotional coldness. It is not. It is emotional maturity. The ability to hold experience without being crushed by it. Composure changes how others perceive you. People sense when someone is not internally chaotic. They trust calm. They defer to stability. In conflict, the person who stays silent longest often controls the outcome, not because they dominate, but because they are not leaking emotion. Silence creates authority without effort. Buddhism understands this deeply. The Buddha did not teach silence to make people passive. He taught it to make them free. Free from compulsive desire, free from reflexive anger, free from the fear that comes from constantly protecting an identity. When the mind is silent, identity softens. You no longer need to defend an image of yourself. And when there is nothing to defend, you become very difficult to disturb. This is where power becomes unmistakable. A silent mind does not chase validation. It does not beg for recognition. It does not crumble under criticism. Praise passes through. Blame passes through. You remain. This stability is rare, and rarity carries weight. Most people are exhausted because their minds never rest. Even when nothing is happening, the mind is busy reliving, anticipating, comparing, judging. This constant activity drains energy. Silence restores it. When the mental noise quiets, energy returns to the body. Attention becomes sharper. Action becomes cleaner. Life feels lighter, not because problems disappear, but because you are no longer carrying unnecessary weight. Buddhism teaches that peace is not found by fixing everything outside. It is found by stopping the inner war. Silence ends that war. And when the war ends, something unexpected emerges. Joy without cause. Not excitement, not pleasure. A quiet contentment that does not depend on circumstances. This is deeply threatening to systems built on craving and fear. A person who does not need constant stimulation or validation is difficult to control. This is why silence is revolutionary. A silent mind sees through false urgency. It recognizes when action is required and when it is ego demanding relief. It stops wasting energy on battles that do not matter. It chooses carefully where to engage. Over time, this selectivity compounds. Life becomes simpler, not smaller. Focus replaces chaos. Suffering ends not because life becomes easy, but because resistance ends. You stop demanding permanence from impermanent things. You stop expecting certainty from uncertainty. You stop asking the world to stabilize your inner state. Buddhism calls this wisdom, but it feels like relief. And from that relief, power grows naturally. Not the power to control others, but the power to remain intact no matter what happens. Loss no longer destroys you. Change no longer terrifies you. Failure no longer defines you. Success no longer intoxicates you. You move through life with steadiness instead of tension. This is the quiet strength people feel, but cannot explain. The silent mind does not announce itself. It does not need to. It wins by not being dragged into unnecessary suffering. It wins by conserving energy. It wins by seeing clearly when others are blinded by noise. In the end, Buddhism does not promise a life without pain. It promises a mind that no longer turns pain into endless suffering, and that difference changes everything. When the mind becomes silent, suffering loses its voice. What remains is awareness, clarity, and an unshakable calm. That calm is not emptiness. It is power. 8. Silence is the highest form of self-respect. There is a level beyond discipline, beyond control, beyond even detachment. Buddhism points to it quietly, almost indirectly. Silence as self-respect. Not silence because you are afraid to speak. Not silence because you have nothing to say. Silence because you finally understand your own value. Most people talk too much because they don't trust their presence. They explain themselves excessively. They justify their decisions. They defend their boundaries. They react to accusations that don't deserve oxygen. This is not communication. It is insecurity leaking out. The mind feels threatened, so it speaks to protect itself. A silent mind does not feel that threat. In Buddhism, self-respect is not ego. Ego demands recognition. Self-respect does not. Ego reacts to defend an image. Self-respect remains still because it knows what it is without needing confirmation. This is why silence becomes natural once the mind is settled. You stop feeling the need to prove, convince, or perform. Think carefully about this. Who are the people you instinctively respect the most? Usually, they are not the loudest. They are not constantly explaining themselves. They don't rush to respond to every challenge. Their words are few, but when they speak, it matters. Their silence feels intentional, not empty. That is self-respect embodied. Buddhism teaches that every unnecessary reaction is a form of self-disrespect. Each time you allow someone's behavior to dictate your inner state, you hand over authority. Each time you argue with someone committed to misunderstanding you, you waste energy you will never recover. Silence is the moment you stop participating in your own depletion. This does not mean you tolerate abuse or injustice. It means you choose your engagement deliberately. You stop responding from wounded pride and start responding from grounded clarity. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself is to say nothing and walk away. Silence says, I don't need to lower myself into chaos to validate my worth. This is extremely difficult at first because the ego hates being ignored, especially your own. The urge to speak arises not from wisdom, but from discomfort. Silence forces you to sit with that discomfort without trying to relieve it through words. Over time, this builds an inner dignity that cannot be shaken. People often mistake silence for submission. That misunderstanding works in your favor. A person who respects themselves does not rush to correct every false assumption. They understand that being misunderstood is sometimes cheaper than constant explanation. Buddhism recognizes this deeply. Not every truth needs to be spoken. Not every thought needs to be expressed. Discernment is respect in action. Silence also protects your inner life. When you speak constantly, you expose yourself unnecessarily. Opinions invite opposition. Reactions invite escalation. Silence keeps your inner world intact. It allows you to process privately instead of bleeding publicly. This privacy is not secrecy, it is boundaries. Boundaries are a form of self-respect most people never learn. A silent mind sets boundaries without confrontation. It does not announce them, it enforces them through behavior. You stop responding to what drains you. You disengage from what disrespects you. You no longer need to convince others of your limits. Your absence becomes the message. Buddhism teaches that peace is not achieved by controlling others, but by choosing wisely where to place attention. Silence is the ultimate filter. Only what truly matters passes through. As self-respect deepens, another shift occurs. You stop internal self-attack. Most people are loud externally because they are cruel internally. The mind constantly judges itself, compares itself, criticizes itself. Silence softens this violence. When the mind quiets, self-compassion becomes possible. You stop narrating your flaws endlessly. You stop punishing yourself with thought. This internal silence is the foundation of genuine confidence. Confidence is not bravado. It is not assertiveness training. It is the absence of inner hostility. When you are no longer at war with yourself, the need to dominate conversations, prove intelligence, or win arguments fades. You already feel whole, and wholeness does not shout. In Buddhism, the highest form of respect is non-harm, including harm done through words, thoughts, and reactions. Silence reduces harm. It reduces unnecessary conflict. It reduces regret. It reduces self-betrayal. Over time, you notice something subtle but powerful. Your words become sharper because there are fewer of them. Your presence becomes heavier because it is undiluted. People begin to listen more closely, not because you demand attention, but because you no longer waste it. This is the paradox of silence. The less you speak from insecurity, the more authority your voice carries when it finally appears. Silence is not emptiness. It is restraint guided by self-knowledge. It is the moment you stop begging the world to acknowledge your worth and start living as if it is already established. Buddhism does not frame this as pride. It frames it as alignment. Alignment with reality, with impermanence, with inner truth. When the mind is silent, you stop violating yourself with unnecessary reactions. You stop chasing validation. You stop arguing with people who cannot hear you. You stop explaining what does not need explanation. That is self-respect in its purest form. And once you reach that level of silence, you don't just protect your peace, you honor yourself. 9. Silence reveals who you really are. Most people have never met themselves. They've met their reactions, their habits, their defenses, their roles, but not themselves. Buddhism is blunt about this. As long as the mind is noisy, your true nature is buried under layers of conditioning. Silence is not just calming, it is revealing, and what it reveals can be unsettling at first. When the mind is loud, identity feels solid. You know who you are because you are constantly telling yourself who you are. Your opinions, your memories, your fears, your ambitions, they talk non-stop. But Buddhism asks a dangerous question. If you stop the talking, what remains? Silence exposes how much of you was noise. This is why people avoid silence. The moment the mind quiets, the usual labels weaken. The story of me starts to dissolve. You notice that anger comes and goes, fear comes and goes, confidence comes and goes, even motivation comes and goes. If these things were truly you, they wouldn't disappear. This realization shakes the foundation most people stand on, but it also frees you. In Buddhism, suffering is tightly linked to mistaken identity. You believe you are your thoughts, so every negative thought feels personal. You believe you are your emotions, so every emotional wave feels like a crisis. Silence creates distance. You start to see thoughts as events, not truths. Emotions as movements, not definitions. This distance is not dissociation, it is clarity. With clarity comes honesty. When the mind is silent, there is nowhere to hide. You see your insecurities without excuses. You see your attachments without justification. You see your fear without blaming others. This can feel uncomfortable, even painful. But it is also the first time you are seeing yourself without distortion. Most people spend their lives running from this moment. They fill silence with distractions because they are afraid of what will surface. But Buddhism teaches that what surfaces is not dangerous. What's dangerous is never seeing it. Silence does not create flaws, it reveals them, so they can lose their grip. And it doesn't only reveal weakness, it reveals strength you didn't know you had. Underneath the noise, there is steadiness. Underneath the fear, there is awareness. Underneath the urge to react, there is choice. Silence lets you feel this directly, not as a concept, but as experience. You begin to trust something deeper than mood or circumstance. This is where inner authority is born. When you know yourself beyond reaction, you stop outsourcing your identity. You are no longer defined by how others treat you, because you've seen that your core remains unchanged. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't erase you. You don't disappear when things go wrong. Silence shows you that you are not fragile. This realization changes how you move through the world. You stop performing. You stop exaggerating. You stop shrinking. You don't need to announce who you are because you are no longer unsure. Your actions become simpler, more aligned. There is less internal contradiction. Buddhism calls this alignment with reality. Reality is not the story you tell about yourself. It is the awareness that notices the story. Silence strengthens that awareness, and awareness, once stable, becomes unshakable. You don't need to constantly reinforce it with thought. Another uncomfortable truth emerges in silence. Many of your struggles were self-created, not because you are bad or weak, but because you were unconscious. You believed thoughts too quickly. You identified with emotions too deeply. Silence does not shame you for this, it educates you. It shows you how suffering was constructed, piece by piece. And once you see the construction, you can stop rebuilding it. This is not self-improvement, it is self-discovery. The more silence you allow, the less you feel the need to become someone else. You stop chasing a future version of yourself to escape the present one. Contentment begins to arise, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with who you are right now. This is deeply threatening to modern culture. A person who knows themselves does not need constant validation. A person who is comfortable in silence does not need constant stimulation. A person who has seen through identity does not need to prove superiority or chase approval. They become difficult to market to, difficult to pressure, difficult to control. Silence reveals this independence naturally. Over time, something subtle but profound shifts. You begin to act from inner coherence instead of external expectation. Your decisions feel cleaner. Your boundaries feel natural. You no longer second-guess yourself endlessly because you are not relying on mental noise for guidance. You trust awareness instead. This does not make you rigid. It makes you flexible without losing center. You can adapt without dissolving. You can engage without becoming entangled. Silence teaches you how to be in the world without being owned by it. In Buddhism, enlightenment is not about becoming special. It is about becoming honest. Silence is the tool that strips away illusion until only what is real remains. What remains is not dramatic. It is simple, present, aware. And once you recognize that presence as who you really are, fear loses its foundation, because you are no longer trying to protect a fragile identity made of thoughts. You have found something quieter, something stable, something that was there before the noise and will remain after it fades. That is who silence reveals. And once you meet that part of yourself, you stop searching everywhere else. 10. Silence is the final freedom. At the deepest level, Buddhism does not aim to make you calmer, wiser, or more productive. Those are side effects. The real aim is freedom, and silence is the doorway to it. Not silence as an escape from the world, but silence as the end of bondage to the mind's compulsions. Most people think they are free because they can choose what to do. Buddhism goes further and asks a more uncomfortable question. Can you choose what you think, what you feel, and how you react? If the answer is no, then freedom is incomplete. A mind that is constantly pulled by craving, fear, and aversion is not free, no matter how many external choices it has. Silence breaks those chains at their root. As long as the mind is noisy, it is constantly leaning towards something or pushing something away, wanting, resisting, comparing, regretting, planning. This endless movement creates a subtle tension that never fully relaxes. Even pleasure is contaminated by fear of loss. Even success carries anxiety about maintaining it. This is the quiet suffering Buddhism points to, the suffering people normalize because they have never known anything else. Silence introduces a different mode of being. When the mind settles, it stops leaning. It stops grasping for the next moment and resisting the present one. For the first time, experience is allowed to be exactly what it is. This does not make life dull. It makes it complete. You are no longer waiting for life to begin somewhere else. This is why silence feels unfamiliar at first. The mind has been trained to believe that movement equals existence. When movement slows, the ego panics. It whispers that you are wasting time, losing ambition, becoming passive. Buddhism recognizes this voice and does not negotiate with it. It knows that voice is fear, fear of losing control over the narrative. But when you stay with silence long enough, something extraordinary happens. You realize you are still here. You are still aware, still alive, still capable. The feared collapse never comes. Instead, a deeper stability appears. You stop needing constant stimulation to feel real. You stop needing constant achievement to feel worthy. You stop needing constant affirmation to feel secure. This is freedom from dependence. Silence also reveals the final illusion, that happiness is something to be achieved later. Buddhism dismantles this completely. Happiness is not a future state. It is the absence of unnecessary resistance in the present. Silence removes that resistance, not by force, but by understanding. When the mind is silent, you are not trying to escape this moment or improve it mentally. You are simply here. And in that simplicity, a quiet satisfaction arises. Not excitement, not euphoria, a grounded okayness that does not depend on circumstances. This is deeply countercultural and deeply liberating. Most people are exhausted because they are always somewhere else mentally. Silence brings you home. From this place, action still happens. You still work, plan, build, and engage. But the energy is different. Action no longer comes from lack, it comes from clarity. You are not trying to fill a hole or outrun discomfort. You are responding to what is needed, nothing more. This is why silence feels like freedom rather than restraint. Nothing is being suppressed. Nothing is being denied. Desire may arise, but it no longer drags you. Fear may arise, but it no longer rules you. Thoughts may arise, but they no longer define you. You are no longer inside the mind is inside awareness. That shift changes everything. Freedom also means freedom from the need to control life. Control is the ego's attempt to manage uncertainty. Silence reveals that uncertainty is not the enemy. Resistance to uncertainty is. When the mind is quiet, uncertainty feels spacious instead of threatening. You become flexible, open, curious. You stop demanding guarantees from a world that cannot provide them. This acceptance is not weakness, it is realism. And realism is stabilizing. One of the most radical outcomes of silence is the end of inner conflict. The constant inner argument, I should be different, life should be different, people should be different, finally exhausts itself. Silence ends the argument not by winning it, but by seeing it as unnecessary. With the argument gone, peace is not something you chase, it is what remains. This is why Buddhism says enlightenment is not something you gain, but something you stop obscuring. Silence removes the obstruction. What remains is simple awareness, steady and unthreatened. From that awareness, fear loses its foundation. Death loses its terror. Failure loses its sting. Success loses its intoxication. You are no longer clinging to experiences to define yourself. You are experiencing them fully without being owned by them. That is freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, not freedom from effort. Freedom from compulsion, freedom from inner slavery, freedom from the belief that you must constantly manage yourself through force and noise. Silence teaches you that nothing essential is missing, and when nothing feels missing, the endless chase ends. You are no longer trying to arrive somewhere else. You are already here. That is the final freedom Buddhism points to. Quiet, ordinary, unshakable, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. If you truly understand this, your life will start to change quietly. No announcements, no dramatic transformations, just fewer reactions, fewer regrets, fewer battles that were never worth fighting. You will notice how often silence protects you, how clarity replaces chaos, how strength shows up without noise. This is not a technique you use once. It is a way of being you return to again and again. When the mind stops shouting, truth becomes audible. And when truth guides you instead of impulse, you no longer need to dominate the world because you have mastered yourself.